Hi, this is Gwen Fisher with Environmental and Occupational Health 6639, Occupational Health Psychology, where we're discussing improving health and well-being at work. Module 3 in this course is about work motivation. This is Module 3.1, in which I provide an introduction to work motivation. Basically, what is it that we do and why do we do it? Here is the agenda for Module 3.1. First, I'll begin by defining motivation, simply to put all of us on the same page regarding what I mean when I say motivation. Secondly, I'll provide a definition of job performance and explain how job performance relates back to work motivation. Third, we'll discuss intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And following from that, talk about a specific theory that integrates and extends what we know about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. This theory is called self-determination theory. Here are the learning objectives for Module 3.1. By the end of this module, you should be able to define work motivation, hopefully in your own words, understand the factors that comprise what we mean by job performance, explain the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, and explain the basic propositions of self-determination theory. So what is work motivation? In its essence, it refers to why we do what we do. It's important because it pervades just about everything we do, from personal tasks and household chores. I don't know about you, but I've never been good at doing laundry, let alone trying to now manage for a family of 4. I don't know why I would think that now having to fold clothes for 4 people, too big and too little, would somehow get better given the monstrous pile. But for whatever reason, it's definitely something that I struggle with. I think each of us has the things that we're really motivated to do and we look forward to, and the things that we don't. And by talking about motivation and then talking about motivation in a work context, hopefully we will be able to better understand all of this. So work motivation refers to a set of energetic forces that originate both within us as well as outside or beyond us to initiate our work-related behavior and also to determine its form, the direction. In other words, are we going in the direction that our employer wants us to go, or are we being a little counterproductive? How intense are we working? Are we working at our absolute maximum in terms of working quickly and fast and with as much energy and engagement as we can, or at a more typical pace? Or maybe some days we just work at a slow pace. And finally, the duration for sustaining this energetic force. Is it in the short term or the long term? And we can quantify that a bit more. Our everyday lives and our work is based on people engaging in behaviors. Just like we may not consciously think about whether our heart is beating or whether we're breathing, we also may not think about everything that we're doing or, in fact, why we do it. But for work organizations and managers to encourage workers to do what they were hired to do, and sometimes to do this in a specific way. For example, to motivate workers to engage in safe work practices, it helps to understand where our motivation comes from. So what is job performance? In the broadest sense, organizations, managers, and employees are often concerned about job performance. Why? Because it's the ultimate outcome so that we can figure out if we're doing what we need or what we're expected to do. In other words, what do we accomplish and how well do we do it? According to industrial organizational psychologists, there are 3 components of performance. The first, even before we can talk about motivation, is ability. That is, broadly speaking, having the knowledge, skills, and specific abilities to perform the duties that are required for the job. Here's an example. Let's think about a surgeon who needs to have knowledge of the human body, perhaps knowledge of specific organs and the way they function in the body, knowledge of surgical procedures and equipment, and so forth. In addition to knowledge, surgeons need to have skills in order to perform detailed as well as complex tasks. And then finally, they need abilities like reasoning and problem sensitivity. Problem sensitivity refers to our ability to tell when something is wrong or if it's likely to go wrong. Probably a skill that if any of us were on the operating room table, that we would want that surgeon to have. And additionally, surgeons need manual dexterity as well as finger dexterity when it comes to making very precise movements with our fingers. So before we can worry about whether a surgeon is motivated at work, we want to make sure that they have the specific ability to do the job. And then broadly speaking, for any job, we want to make sure that whoever is hired has the ability. Next comes motivation. Motivation is, as we already defined, having the energy to do what is needed and then to have the energy to meet the performance goals and the expectations. Ability and motivation are both critical factors for job performance, but we also need to take into account the work environment. During this course, and especially starting in Module 4, when we talk about leadership and organizational culture, we will definitely go into more detail. But broadly speaking, we can think about the work environment in terms of the physical structure in which we work, the built environment, from the broad building as well as our own individual office space. There are other aspects of the physical environment that are important for performance as well. What is the temperature? Are we exposed to noise or other exposures in the work environment that might affect our performance in doing our job? Beyond the physical work environment, there's also the social work environment. And a great deal of the material and information we're going to talk about in this course concerns the social environment. In other words, who do we work with and what are those interactions like? Are they positive? Are they negative? What kind of leaders do we have? We will again discuss much more of that going on forward in the course. Now let's talk about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. It's likely that you've heard these terms and you may already know what they are and even be able to define them on your own. But so that we're all on the same page, I'll say that extrinsic motivation comes from outside of a person. In other words, it's factors that are given to or done to someone. And an example is when you're paid for doing your work, and pay is an incentive. It could be your regular wages or salary, or if you receive a bonus or extra money for a particular task. There are other forms of extrinsic motivation, even such as praise or someone telling you that you did a good job. This is a form of extrinsic motivation because it comes from somebody else, it comes from outside. Intrinsic motivation, on the other hand, originates from inside of each of us. In other words, we engage in behavior that's personally rewarding, and it's something that we feel good about regardless of anyone or anything external to us. An example of this is truly just enjoying the nature of the work that we do or finding that it's personally meaningful. So following on from what I just described about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, I'm going to talk now about self-determination theory. This is a broad theory that proposes that the way we're motivated really ranges on a continuum from intrinsic to extrinsic factors, or I guess from extrinsic to intrinsic. In other words, is our motivation and behavior self-determined and self-motivated, or is it motivated by external forces? So, for example, we may find our work personally meaningful, but we also appreciate and get a burst of motivation when we receive praise or positive feedback from others about something that we do. Just like we're often in paid work employment, paid to do our jobs, but we may not be given extra money or extra benefits if we go above and beyond, and yet oftentimes many of us do. So in other words, our motivation isn't all just intrinsic or all just extrinsic. Researchers Deci and Ryan, who developed self-determination theory, framed motivation on this continuum. Their early research in the 1970s found that extrinsic motivation actually can undermine intrinsic motivation. So what do I mean that extrinsic motivation can undermine intrinsic motivation? I'm going to now tell you about a series of studies that Deci conducted and how he came to this conclusion. Deci conducted a series of 3 experiments, two in the lab and 1 in the field, to look at what happens to motivation in response to different types of rewards. The first experiment tested the hypothesis that if an individual is intrinsically motivated to perform an activity, that introducing an extrinsic reward decreases the degree of intrinsic motivation to perform the task. So how did he do this? There were 24 undergraduate psychology students who participated in the first lab experiment. They were assigned randomly to one of 2 groups, the experimental group and the control group. Each group participated in 3 sessions on 3 different days. During each of these sessions, these students participated in working to solve a cube puzzle. The experimenters assumed that this particular puzzle was an activity that college students would be intrinsically motivated to do. The puzzle could be put together to form many different configurations. In each of the sessions, the participants were shown 4 different configurations on a piece of paper and asked to draw the puzzle to reproduce the configurations. The first and third sessions for the experimental condition and the control group were identical. But in the second session, the one in the middle, participants in the experimental condition were given $1 for completing each puzzle within the time period that they were assigned. During the middle of the session, the experimenter left the room for 8 minutes, and the participants were told that they were free to do whatever they wanted during that time. Meanwhile, the experimenter observed them from another room. The amount of time that they spent working on the puzzle during the free choice period was how they measured the students' motivation for the puzzle. What Deci found, as he expected, is that when the external reward was introduced in the second session, the participants spent more time working on the puzzles during the free choice period compared to the first session when they weren't given any instruction or additional reward. But in the third session, when the external reward was removed, they spent less time working on the puzzle compared to the first session. All of the subjects reported that the task was interesting and enjoyable at the end of each session, which provided some evidence that doing these puzzles was intrinsically motivating. But the results showed that applying the external reward, paying them $1, and then not paying them $1 in the third condition reduced their motivation. In case you're wondering why $1 might actually be motivating for people, I just want to remind you that this is work that was done in the 1970s, and the value of $1 then was a little bit different and a little bit more than it is today, unfortunately. So the second experiment that Deci conducted was very, very similar to the first one, although it took place in a natural setting. Specifically, there were 8 student workers who were observed at a college newspaper, and the students were given extra money in the second session for each headline that they wrote, and then in the third experimental session, they were no longer paid on a per headline basis. The results of the second experiment in the natural setting were very consistent with what Deci found in the first study. In other words, the number of headlines written or the outcome in terms of what was produced in the time period decreased after giving a reward and then removing the extrinsic reward. The third experiment was very, very similar to the first one. Back in the lab, the experimenter had students do a puzzle task. And the one thing that was different about the third experiment is that instead of giving each of the participants $1, they were just given verbal praise and told about what kind of job they were doing. And in fact, the results of study 3 were really very similar to studies 1 and 2, that when no longer given an extrinsic reward, in this case the verbal praise, that performance decreased. So that's what I mean when I say that this research found that extrinsic rewards tend to undermine intrinsic motivation. So researchers Deci and Ryan later further developed self-determination theory. Based on a lot more research that these individuals conducted over the years, they identified 3 key needs that individuals have that influence their motivation. The first of these is competence. In other words, we like to be good at what we do and develop mastery. So by aiming to control the outcome, we can achieve this mastery. Secondly, as human beings who are social creatures, we have a need and a desire to interact with other people. And finally, these researchers found that many individuals appreciate autonomy, that is, being in control of the situation and being able to have an influence over the outcome. Autonomy is a topic we're going to talk a great deal about in this course. Perhaps you can think about whether you've ever been micromanaged in a work situation. And if you have, my guess is that it's not something you enjoyed. And that's probably because we don't often like to be told what to do and how to do it. Instead, we prefer to have some control over what's happening. So at this point in Module 3, there are 4 questions I would like you to think about. First, what motivates you to do a good job at work? Second, what do you think motivates people that you work with to do their best at work? What are the specific intrinsic and extrinsic motivating factors involved? Do you agree with competence, relatedness, and autonomy, or are there other needs? And finally, do you agree with the research by Deci and Ryan that extrinsic motivation can undermine intrinsic motivation? I wish that I had the opportunity to hear your thoughts and have you share with me what you're thinking right now. Unfortunately, the nature of the online course here is such that I can't hear what you have to say about this in response, but we'll do our best to use the discussion board going forward as well. So that concludes Module 3.1. We're going to move on in Module 3 to the next segment to talk about other needs-based theories of work motivation.